Well, hello, that's me again. Today is the last day of this leap year's February 29th, and I have some very special, surprise for you, which I wrote for a couple of weeks now. And it is with great pleasure that I present to you Colonel Mr. Jacques Baud, and the author of the outstanding book, which is The Russian Art of War and How the West Led Ukraine to the Defeat. And it's my pleasure to introduce Mr. Jacques Baud. And my first question will be, please tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, thank you very much for inviting me to your show. And very pleased. I'm following you very frequently, so it's a pleasure to be with you tonight.
The privilege is all mine.
My name is Jacques Baud, as you correctly said. I used to be a colonel in the Swiss Army, colonel of general staff. In fact, I'm what the Russian would say a Genstabist. During the Cold War, I worked for strategic intelligence. That means that I was in charge of the whole Warsaw Pact, the whole forces of the Warsaw Pact, not only in the Warsaw Pact, by the way, but also those forces that were in Afghanistan and elsewhere in the world. And I was also in charge of the armies of ex-Yugoslavia, the whole communist bloc, if you want. And that was my job, to monitor them and to understand what they were doing, what we understood or what we alleged they would do. I think the main issue I had to do, in fact, was to understand how they think and how they wage war. And the discussions we have seen recently about the way Russia is conducting this conflict in Ukraine reminds me very much the discussions we had during the Cold War with my partners, because as Switzerland has never been really neutral as it comes to military matters. In fact, I was trained in strategic intelligence in the US, in the Washington DC area, and I was also trained in intelligence in the UK, and we had regular meetings with our European or NATO partners, I would say, to discuss these matters. So I learned Russian as well, and for that reason, the assessment of the then Soviet forces and today Russian forces is something which I'm used to, and I was trained for that. After leaving after the Cold War, just at the end of the Cold War, I left the strategic intelligence. I started to work for the. I had a brief, a very short stay with the agencies that deal with purchasing of procurement of armament, and then I went working for the UN. I used to be. I helped to create operational intelligence for the UN, and I led I think probably that was the biggest intelligence service in the Sudan. That was a multidimensional service, a civilian and military, to assess the situation in Sudan and the whole surrounding countries. And then I spent some times in New York as head of policy and doctrine for the peacekeeping operations. I did the same job for the African Union in Kenya, in Nairobi. And then my last assignment was in NATO, which is quite surprising for a Swiss, since Switzerland is not a member of NATO. I was the only Swiss officer in NATO at that time. That comes from a special agreement between Switzerland and NATO in the framework of the Partnership for Peace. And NATO agreed to have one position for a Swiss officer. And I started there. That was 2012, if I'm not wrong, and that came exactly at the point where we started to see the situation developing in Ukraine. And I was in charge of the struggle against proliferation of small arms. Therefore, NATO asked me to monitor the situation in the Donbas area, because obviously there were, and in Crimea as well, by the way, because there were this issue of small arms, and everybody thought that it was coming from Russia. Nobody thought it would come from Ukrainian military. In fact, I surprised everybody when I said that. But anyway, and since I am also UN expert in the rule of law and reform of the security institution, I was also involved by NATO to participate to the restructuration of the Ukrainian armed forces that were asked for in 2014 by the Ukrainian government, and I contributed to this reform of the security institution in Ukraine. So I have spent quite a time in Ukraine and in assessing the situation in Ukraine, and therefore, when this the special operation started in February 2022, I felt almost compelled to provide my view on the conflict. I'm no longer in activity. I'm retired now, and therefore I have the freedom. I'm not revealing or any secrets. I'm just keeping my own opinion and my experience on that. But that was definitely the view of an insider in this conflict, because I noticed when I was in NATO at that time, people had the totally wrong assessment of the situation. Most of the information we received came from Poland or Lithuania or so. So therefore, you can imagine that it was not really the most impartial or objective information we could get. In any case, I wrote 4 books about the war in Ukraine. The one you just mentioned, the Russian Art of War, is the 4th one, the very last one, that was published about 1 month ago. And that's in a nutshell about me. I can certainly provide other details if you want, but
oh no, it's a great introduction, and absolutely, and I really appreciate actually, and we're probably gonna touch upon your background more as we probably will have more than one meeting. I certainly hope so. And the question, obviously, which you raised here as being the insider. And I want to quote from your book immediately, because these are the quotations and parts which really interest me, because I also wrote 3 books about what you call the quote unquote military experts. Me being former cadre officer with professional military background from the Soviet armed forces, I was absolutely terrified when I was reading what is being written about Russia as a whole, and then of course about Russian armed forces. And I want to quote it because you are, together with Lester Grau and Charles Bartels, literally just only people, from what I know, across the whole publishing business on the military affairs of Russia in the Western world, who actually have a grasp of Russian, not tactics. We're not interested in the tactical minutia. It's about how Russians conduct operations, and you being the Genstabist, the general staff officer, how important Russian general staff is and how dramatically different it is from what is being presented as the command and control structure in the United States. And let me read one of your quotes, which is actually, I believe it is this. And throughout the Cold War period, the Soviet Union saw itself at the spearhead of historic struggle, which I love what you mentioned here, that would lead to a confrontation between the capitalist system and progressive forces. My God, it is coming true. And this perception of permanent and inescapable war led the Soviets to study war in quasi scientific way, and to structure this thinking into architecture of military thought that has no equal in the Western world. The problem with the vast majority of our so-called military experts is their inability to understand the Russian approach to war. It's the result of an approach we already seen in waves of terrorist attacks. The adversary is so stupidly demonized that we fail to understand this way of thinking. As a result, we are unable to develop strategies, articulate our forces, or even equip them for the realities of war. The corollary of this approach is that our frustrations are translated by unscrupulous media into a narrative that feeds hatred and increases our vulnerability. We're thus unable to find a rational and effective solution to the problem. This is an outstanding, basically, paragraph. It is very heavy, but in the same time, it is profound and it is deep. And immediately when we talk about this, which is, and again, it's an extremely astute observation on your part. Can you tell me a little bit, indeed, on the especially European part of the so-called military experts and media? Because I am stupefied, as many of my audience and those who read my books, to the level of incompetence, which is absolutely shocking.
Yes. No, I think you're absolutely right. The thing is that during the Cold War, because of the scarcity of information, we were obliged to try to understand and to discuss. And we had numerous discussions with the Americans, with the Brits, with the French, with the Italians, and whoever, to discuss all aspects of what we could read in Krasnaya Zvezda or Voyenny Viesnik, and so on and so forth, who were very interesting publication, by the way, that today nobody reads anymore, or not so much. But during the Cold War, including during the war in Afghanistan, to understand the approach, the Soviet approach, we were obliged to read those publications. And very interestingly enough, people don't. I mean, most experts that you have right now on the market are people that are too young, and they don't really, they don't have this historical background, if you want. But at that time, I remember that you had such discussions in the Soviet publications about tactics in Afghanistan. You had commanders on the ground criticizing the decisions or the strategic decisions or operational decisions, and you had really discussions. Of course, it was not internet, so that means that you had to wait for the publication of the document every week or every month, but it was much more interactive than what we think. And at that time, we recognized in the intelligence world, we recognized that, and everybody was reading Voyenny Viesnik and Voyenny Missile and so on and so forth.
That's the fourth one.
Yes, because there are so many, by the way. There were an incredible number of military publications in which doctrine was detailed, publicized, discussed, and even controversially discussed. So the idea that we have, because we tried to have a picture of the Soviet Union at the time and Russia today, that it is just a top-to-down approach. It's not exactly that. In the military, you had a lot of interaction. It's much more open than people think. And probably I would say that the Russian military system is probably even more open than many NATO or Western armies, in fact. And that's the reason why you see, by the way, you see that in Ukraine, that the experience of the field go right to the top and get converted into new equipment or new procedures, and you see the return on experience that comes very quickly from the field to the command and then back to the field in the form of standardized procedures. And that's something that I'm not sure that Western armies have developed such an interactive process. In any case, during the Cold War, the main issue that we had to face was to understand exactly what was in the mind of the Soviets at the time. So we were used to understand war, or try to understand war as the Soviet would understand war, and it's an intellectual and psychological or mental posture that has been lost so far, because since the end of the Cold War, the West has waged so many wars without having to take into consideration tactics or operations or whatever of the enemy, because there were none. Basically, there were not really tactical doctrines in Iraq or so, or in Afghanistan. You had just probably tactical tricks and tactical methods, but not really a tactical doctrine or operational doctrine. So that means that the military that is currently active has not been trained in trying to understand how the enemy thinks, how enemy will shape its thinking, how it will shape its operation, how it will shape its action. And that, I think, is exactly what is missing. And we could see that already during the Syrian war, where the Russians were involved. They were involved quite successfully, actually. But we tried always to understand what they did just in the light of what the West was doing. And I was amazed to see that for this recent conflict in Ukraine, in France especially, people in TV shows also were thinking like French officers and just projecting their own thinking to the Russians and say, well, they're doing wrong because we should do like this or like that. So this is just the inability to understand the way of thinking of the adversary. And there is a second aspect to that. Something which we tend to forget is that an army is a system. It is a system. It is a system with its software, like Doctrine and so on, its procedures, strategy and tactics and things like that, its hardware, obviously, airplanes, tanks, and so on. And when you see, and it's very interesting, by the way, because in my book, I try to make, to illustrate the difference between the tanks that were supplied to Ukraine and the Russian tanks. They were not designed for the same environment. They were not designed for the same command and control. They were not designed for the same type of operation. As a result, you have the hardware. You cannot just take a tank and use it. A tank that was designed like the Leopard 2. I used to be commander of a Leopard 2 battalion. So I know what I'm talking about. The Leopard 2 battalion is an excellent tank, but it was designed for Central Europe. It was not designed for the flat land of Ukraine. And therefore, you can see the shape is much higher than the T-90, for instance. And the T-90 is much lower on the ground. It's much harder to detect visually. And therefore, it has the T-90 or T-80 and so on. They have their own advantages just because of the shape. It's just a simple example, but it just shows that when you have an army, we tend to just to count the number of tanks, the number of guns, number of men, and things like this. But we tend to ignore or to forget or to underestimate the value of all these aspects to be bound into one single system. And in fact, what we are witnessing today in Ukraine is that because Ukraine is basically, I mean, when I was in Ukraine in 2014, 2015, we had in Ukraine an army that was based on the Soviet Union, basically. I mean, the software, so to say, is the one that very similar to the one you had in Russia or in the Soviet Union at the time. And because NATO tried to transform that software into a NATO software, you don't really have a stable doctrinal thinking in Ukraine, first of all. So that's the first point. But then you had also other aspects, because when the West was supplying tanks, and by the way, all sorts of tanks, you know, the Leopard 2 is an excellent tank, but it was designed to fight by the Germans in a specific environment. When you mix that with AMX-10RC, the French AMX, that were designed for desert warfare, more or less, or African warfare, you have a mix that is almost impossible to combine into a consistent system. And that's then you have other aspects like other weapons or command and control system, electronic system that are not compatible together. While on the Russian side, regardless of the generation of the equipment, it was always integrated into one single system. And therefore, in terms of command and control, and in the I would say the easy command and control in that sense, the Russians have an advantage, but from the very beginning, because they have one doctrine. This doctrine has really changed. I mean, basically, the Russian doctrine you have today is the same as you had during the Soviet. It has evolved because you have different technological aspects that have been integrated. That's why I have in my book, I have this chart that explains all the relationships between technology, history, and all that in the military in the Russian military thinking. That's one thing. But if I can summarize a little bit or simplify, you can just remove the Marxist dimension and you have basically the same military doctrine. That means that those people who started their military career during the Soviet time, they have basically the same military doctrine as before. So these guys work in a continuity that has been improved, that has been adjusted and updated according to technologies and all that. But basically, you have a totally consistent system, and that's this is something that we tend to ignore or to underestimate in Europe. It's very interesting, by the way, when we have just a couple of days ago when Emmanuel Macron was announcing or projecting or mentioning the idea that he could send troops. I think people have not really realized the challenge that it could be to send NATO troops who have absolutely not the slightest experience in fighting a conventional war in Ukraine. And by the way, it's very interesting. I mentioned that in my book too, that you have, and that was published. I mean, you had several papers, like even the Washington Post or the New York Times mentioned those interviews with soldiers, Ukrainian soldiers, who told the journalists that basically they were trained by Western officers, but those guys had no idea about the nature of warfare that was waged in Ukraine. Basically, these guys, their only background or their only experience or fighting experience was in Iraq, in Afghanistan, or so against the kind of enemy, which is extremely tough, by the way, because I think working against the Taliban is certainly a tough job. But in any case, the problem is that you don't have the same structural thinking, the same structure of operation, the same structure of tactics that you have facing the Russians. And as a result, those poor Ukrainian soldiers, they were, if you just train them to use a tank, probably it's enough. But when you start using training officers, even junior officers, then of course you are totally wrong. You're totally beside the point, and that's exactly what the Ukrainian soldiers were complaining about. I think we totally misjudged the Russians, and as I always say, you can have. By the way, I mentioned also the media, because I think the media have a critical role in this whole thing, and the problem is that regardless of the conflict, just saying that your enemy is stupid, it has no armament, is no able to fight and all that. So underestimating your enemy is basically the worst mistake you can ever do in a war. And that's exactly the mistake that we pushed the Ukrainian into. So I think this is totally the whole approach of the West in the Ukraine is totally misguided. So I don't know if you have similar experience or views on that, but that's in a nutshell what I thought.
Yeah, it's pretty much my experience too. And one of the things, obviously, being the product of the Soviet fundamental military education, it's all about mathematics. The first thing you do is, which Russians continue to do, is obviously calculating those COFMs, correlation of forces and means, and it's not calculating some things in units. It's calculating them through combat effectiveness, which suddenly become obviously operational level considerations in terms of the combat effectiveness. Nobody cares, tank against tank. Everybody cares about how you bring them to the common denominator, and this is a serious mathematical process and statistics, and that's why I was smiling and nodding actively when you mentioned военная мысль, military thought, because this is what they do. They calculate those coefficients, scale coefficients. They calculate obviously Osipov-Lanchester model, attrition model, which brings us to the other political question. Today, Mr. Austin, the Secretary of Defense, I don't know, listen, I wish him all the best, and you know what, I know he went through the top operation surgery. It's horrible, obviously, and cancer is not the thing to be laughed at, but evidently something is going on with the guy, and he stated that if Ukraine falls, then NATO will fight Russians. And I just like, what, I can only scratch my head, because obviously one of the things which is fundamental in this particular case, apart from having completely, I love the term you mentioned it, tactical tricks. When you look at this in terms of operational doctrine in the United States, it's based on what you mentioned, Iraq, beating some guys. Yes, they are tough, but they are not combined arms armies. The issue is, even if you imagine that somebody decides to commit suicide in NATO, and what Lloyd Austin says, he needs to preposition a gigantic force to fight Russians in Ukraine, or whatever will be left of Ukraine. What are your thoughts about this? Is it PR again?
Yes, well, I think it's a little bit like this, but that relates very much to what Macron said the other day. He said we cannot let a Russian win the war. But first of all, you have to understand what means win the war, or what means lose the war for Ukraine, and that comes to a second point, which is, I think, very important, is that you have an incapacity in the West to define objectives. At the end of the day, where in the Swiss Army, we tend to use the so-called method of Auftragstaktik, which is the no, I don't remember the term in English, but Auftragstaktik means that you just define an objective and you let the commander to take the initiative.
Exactly. That's how it's called. They use German term for that.
Yeah, exactly. And I have I have a complete chapter on that. I mean, a small chapter on that in my book, because that was a very much a discussion in the French, because the French are not used to this kind of control, command and control system. But in any case, the Auftragstactic means that you define an objective and you let the commander or the officer to decide the best way to achieve the objective. But that means that you need to have an objective at first. And so meaning that the objective is the key element to define the way you will fight. And just fighting the Russians is not an objective. You know, and that's what strikes me very much, since we have this the beginning of this this war, in fact, because the West is waging a war against Russia, in fact, and in all aspects, in economics, in the politicals, or the political, on diplomatic side, on the military side, they don't have objectives. And if they had objectives, basically, they would notice that the means that they have used for this objective are totally inadequate. And that's exactly the problem. And that's why I think if it continues that way, I think they absolutely no, I mean, to be honest, I don't think that Ukrainian will be able to reverse the whole situation. But let's say, if it continues that way, there is absolutely no chance to reverse the situation in any case, because you cannot just fight for the sake of fighting. You fight for the sake of achieving an objective, and if you don't know what the objective is, then at least during just before this counteroffensive or so-called super offensive. There was the objective of retaking Crimea or retaking whatever, Donbass, and so on. Well, they have seen that this objective is unachievable. And therefore, now they have dropped the objective. So the idea is just to fight the Russians. And this is a very strange way of understanding war, by the way, and I think we can afford to do that, because in fact, we just wage a war through the Ukrainians. So we don't spare our own blood, we just spare the blood of the Ukrainians. And for that reason, you can afford to have a war just for the sake of having a war. But that's something that leads nowhere, absolutely nowhere. The Russians had two objectives when they attacked on the 24th of February 2022. The two objectives: demilitarization and denazification. The two terms were derived from the Potsdam Declaration of 1945 that applied to Germany at that time. But anyway, so the objective of denazification was, on the military side of this, because there is, when we heard Vladimir Putin during the interview with Tucker Carlson, he mentioned a political side of that. But the military side of the denazification was achieved on the 28th of March 2022, as Mariupol was surrounded. And then the military said, we are not mentioning the denazification anymore because we have achieved that objective. And demilitarization, that was already achieved 3 times, in fact. The first time was achieved in May-June 2022, as the Ukrainians had no longer hardware, and they were dependent on the West for new hardware, meaning tanks and helicopters and artillery and all that. And then they started to receive especially from Eastern Europe, the old remnants of the Soviet or the Cold War. So they received the whole artillery from Estonia and all these old piece of artillery and tanks from Slovakia, from Czechia, and so on and so forth. So the second Ukrainian army, if I can put it that way, was equipped with former Soviet Union equipment, And that was destroyed by the end of 2022. So Russia achieved the objective for a second time. And then you started to have those new tanks, I mean, new equipment from the West, like Leopard 2 and Challengers and M1 Abrams and all that, that were actually, well, not the latest equipment, but still Western equipment that was sent to Ukraine. That was the Third Army, and it was almost defeated during the counteroffensive. And today what we see is the West struggling to find a way to recreate the fourth Ukrainian army, if I can put it that way. So the Russian work with objectives, and these are achievable objectives. These objectives were all achieved. The thing is that the West keeps trying to find a way to refurbish
reconstitute probably something, which, by the way, brings us to your book again, and that brings us to the strategic level of thinking, and that brings us to the old Soviet before World War II a discussion between Tukhachevsky, Svechin, and strategists of this level about, obviously, the crushing strategy and attrition. You write you put it very beautifully. The supply of weapons by the West has led Russia to wage a war of attrition, in which Ukrainian potential is gradually being eroded. Sacrificing troops to protect territory is the worst strategy in this situation. And that brings us to other crucial point, which you will know as being general staff officers. What many people do not understand, especially the way American military thought, so to speak, organized and military organization is functioning, is the fact that Joint Chiefs of Staff doesn't have command and control function, unlike it is the General Staff of Russia, which has the full command and control of the armed forces of Russian Federation, ranging from everything, from the civilian rear to Navy and VKS, what is so could it have played the role that United States and the West insulated? Well, you already pretty much partially answered it. They insulated themselves so much from their outside world, and how their combined arms operations of scale are conducted, that they completely, we know they miscalculated, that they miscalculate to such a degree that at this stage, I'm questioning the military competence of people in the highest political and military position, for example, in Washington, D.C. And after I heard all those generals, I was like, are you kidding me? These guys parade themselves as absolute, amateurs. I don't know why they even dare to risk their whatever left of their remnants of reputation. It is absolutely terrifying. And can you please comment on that?
I completely agree with you. I noticed that when I was, in my own army, by the way, but also when I was visiting other armies, including when I spent 5 years in NATO, and I could notice exactly the same thing. The problem is that, and that's very apparent in Russia, that the Russians see war as a holistic, as I told you, the army is a system, but it works within a system which is war. In fact, they see war as something which is totally holistic, where you have different influences, political, economic, and all that. So no domain is excluded from the military thinking. And that's also why I refer to that chart that I mentioned before when I explain how the military thinking is structured, because everything plays a role in the way the Russians design their strategic thinking. And I was amazed to see that in NATO, but that extends to Switzerland as well, by the way. I was amazed to see that people just see the military side of things. It's just a tank and probably the fuel for the tank but that's it. This is the thinking stops there, and when you see the way the Russians have maneuvered, not just at operational level, but also at strategic level, to keep as you mentioned, by the way, to keep relationship with the rest of the world, by the way, just precisely not to be isolated, meaning that within the war system you have diplomacy, you have politics, you have economics, you have all that plays a role. And that's why the Russians engaged this, or I don't know if it's the West that engaged or the Russian, but let's say the Russians responded to the West, so to say, with a very comprehensive approach of the problem that left absolutely nothing aside. And for that reason, when you see today that the Russian economy is basically growing despite some 18,000 sanctions or something like that, and despite having been isolated from the rest of the world, and when I say rest of the world, I mean the Western world, I mean 40 countries, but this is interesting that despite all this, Russia managed to have a growth rate which outpaces the one of the West, is able to produce more weapons than the whole West combined, including the US that has the largest budget, military budget or defense budget of almost the rest of the world. So despite all this, Russia was able to manage a war, an economic war, a diplomatic war, a military war, and that comes back to the way they think and approach war. And here you see a fundamental weakness of the Western armed forces, because I can even mention a defense system, because we don't have really defense systems, but we have armed forces that are like an island within our countries, so to say. They are not integrated. While in Russia, you see that the whole system is very well integrated. And it's not new, because when you see these initiatives that were made, for instance, a few years ago, by the way, it's not new, but to have this, I don't remember the name, the old regiment, the regiment of those who died during Second World War.
Yeah, Immortal Regiment.
Immortal Regiment, exactly. Yeah. So meaning that sounds, it's a little bit more than exotic, because it binds the society with the history, it binds the society with the military, and it creates again, we are in a kind of system thinking that it's much more elaborated in the Russian culture than it is in the Western culture. Well, I mean, again, I used to be on the Western side of the wall during the Cold War. You were probably on the other side. We were probably fighting each other without knowing it. But I mean, our perception is that during that time, the Soviet system was very much a fighting system already. I mean, basically based on the class struggle and all that. I mean, you had all the Marxist dimension, but there was this idea that the whole society was involved in the struggle. Today, the Marxist dimension has disappeared. Obviously, Russia is a country that has the same system as our, probably. I mean, not exactly the same, but otherwise it wouldn't function. But
strategic resources are nationalized. Russia has
yeah,
complete.
exactly. Yeah, and that's a very important point, by the way, because today we see exactly the weakness of having a defense system that is partly privatized. And in any case, you see that today Russia has kept this kind of integration of the military system into the society, and by keeping, for instance, a part of the armament industry or the military industrial complex as part of the state, works with that idea that you have basically defense as a system. It's a collective system that involves all aspects of society, and that's exactly why I think those who think that they will be able to defeat Russia just by sending a few troops in Ukraine, they are just disillusioning themselves. So it is kind of, it's very strange that in 2 years, and probably more, because obviously the Ukrainian issue is not new, but in all these years nobody really realized the complexity and the yes, the complexity of this Russian defense system, and was not able to elaborate a thinking that is adjusted to this system. And that's the reason why I thought it was necessary to write a book on that dimension, to explain that we are totally misunderstanding the Russians. I mean, we have, obviously they are propagandistic and ideological and other reasons, and probably domestic political issue that prevents us from understanding the Russians. But in any case, the result is that we have pushed Ukrainians into a kind of a trap that we have, in fact, we have created that trap for the Ukrainians. And I find this extremely sad. It's sad for the Russians, but it's sad for the Ukrainians as well, because we created the condition of an impossible war, so to say. I mean, the war is possible, but I mean an impossible success, so to say, an impossible victory. And we have lured the Ukrainian into that impossible idea of victory. And that's tragic in some extent. But it's also tragic for the Russians, because, by the way, even if the Russians have certainly suffered less losses than the Ukraine, still you have losses, and for nothing.
Yeah. Well, evidently that also started the process which we observe now, I think, of the removal of the West from the top of the world. And one of the things which is, I think, when you think even about the start of the, let's say, Western military mythology, much of it obviously goes back to the history of the World War II, the way it was concocted after the start of the Cold War. And yeah, when you have only people of the scale of David Glantz and Jonathan House, who are any authorities on the Eastern Front, and they try and they use actually Russian sources which are much more accurate than, for example, German ones. You know, we all know that, you know, each Wehrmacht soldier killed 10,000 Russian soldiers, but somehow Russians threw the bodies and ended up in Berlin, you know. So it just, and it sadly, especially in the American side, which obviously have been led to believe that they defeated Hitler. And this is also the fact which many people still don't get. They cannot grasp their brains around that. When you begin to confabulate your military history, and you do not open the dark pages of those, and you do not admit mistakes, and as General Robert Latif of the DARPA, PhD in physics, no less. He wrote in his excellent book, The Future War, he writes that pretty much everything what American public knows about the war is from the entertainment industry. and so goes for the political class. And I was absolutely delighted when you mentioned this La Grande Vadrouille, which is in Russian was called Большая Прогулка, and the Russians adore this movie. Again, it's because of the excellent cast and beloved by Russians, Louis de Funès, you know, who obviously, for my generation, Commissar Juve, I mean, you know what, it was the essence of the Fantomas trilogy, you know, so, and it's, how to say it, I started laughing so much when you mentioned about the Russians being presented as this guy from the German Wehrmacht soldier, for people who do not know, who being double vision, he shot their own plane, you know, so all aircraft. So I was laughing really.
Yeah, no, but that's very interesting, because I noticed that. I mean, you know, the French are very keen and making fun of the Germans during Second World War. Although the Germans actually defeated the French. So the interesting thing is that we see the same today with the Russians, and the comparison with the Grande Vadrouille is not so erroneous. I mean, we tend to see the Russians like this, and the interesting thing, when you mention history, when I had the opportunity, because I was part of a delegation that discussed some military matters in the early 90s, and I was in Moscow for that, and I visited the Voroshilov Military Academy. And I was amazed to see that the students were precisely studying one of the operations in 1944, 1945 in Belarus and all that, and they were studying that. And that's interesting, because you have constantly, when you read Russian military literature, that you have reference to those operations, because in fact these operations help to design the modern military thinking of the because you had all the components that you have today. You had the tanks, the aviation, the artillery, the issue, command and control issues, and all that. So all that was started to be designed at that time. But on the Western side, if you look, in fact, the operations that the West had on the Western Front during Second World War is probably not that much to learn about, and because the thing is that when the Russians designed their operations on the Eastern Front in 1944, 1945. They really had a scientific approach to them. So they tried very much, and you had some operations were very much designed as test operations. You know, it was very much a development process. It was not just throwing tanks on the ground and trying to coordinate them. And that's probably what you had much more on the Western side. I mean, from the British and the Americans, they were more pragmatic in that way, not so much scientific in their approach, more pragmatic, and you had kind of trial and error and all that. But on the Western side, it was very much a scientific approach to warfare, and that's therefore they have learned all these lessons, and they have how to say that. If you read the literature, you see that they have not only made those studies during the war, but they are able to extract lessons for today. And that has been a constant process during the whole Cold War, because in the Cold War, we had this, the whole issue that was in the very late 80s at the time. I remember we had the issue of these operational maneuver group. And that was a very much subject of concern in NATO, because NATO was based, I mean, the strategy of NATO was not really offensive. In fact, it was kind of an active defense. And they were afraid that the operational maneuver group could precisely do what we had seen in the early phase of the offensive in Ukraine. That means that you have a group that maneuvers extremely quickly through the defenses without combating probably and arriving up to Kiev. That's exactly what we had in just in the first weeks of February 22. This is probably kind of a mini operational maneuver group that you had there, and that's exactly what the NATO feared in the late 80s. Therefore, we had a lot of discussions, and we tried to go back to everything that and by the way, the Soviets at that time were also discussing more and more. And when you have more discussion in those military literature like Krasnaya Zvezda, not so much, but Voyenny Vestnik or Voyenная Мысль, when you start to have a discussion about a specific topic, that means it's a subject of concern. That means that they are really trying to study and deepen their knowledge on that side. Therefore, we were very much we paid much more attention to these issues, and we notice how profound the Russian let's say approach was to warfare. It was a very much detailed approach, especially about command and control, because when you send an operational group through enemy lines deep in the enemy, then you have to be careful about the command and control, and that's where you had those issues that the Rook and Rock or Разведывательно Udarny complex and so on and so forth.
Strike and fire complexes. Yeah,
exactly. And they started to develop that in Afghanistan. By the way, I remember to have those see those discussions, because the whole issue was that in Afghanistan, in a very difficult terrain, you cannot move very quickly. The only thing that can move very quickly is fire.
Yeah,
that's the quickest that it can move on the battlefield. Therefore, you need to have a command and control for your fire and strike capabilities, and therefore you have to develop your reconnaissance capabilities, and that's give essence or birth to this idea of reconnaissance strike and reconnaissance fire complex are used very much, that have been considerably developed thanks to technology and all that. But that applies also to the problem of projecting a force through the enemy lines in the depth of the enemy. And and these are aspects that are totally ignored by Western experts, because we haven't really followed the whole discussion within the Soviet at the time and Russian today. We tend to be stuck with the tactical success. We don't even think about the operational success, and therefore that translates exactly into the defeat, not defeat, but yes, probably we can call defeat in Ukraine.
Wars are won on the operational and strategic levels. And,
exactly.
What can I say? It was absolutely fascinating having you today. And what you know what? I hope it's not our last meeting. I would love. I'm pretty sure my audience would love to have you back, because you are fascinating, not only just lecturer, you're a great storyteller. So, and in conclusion today, what I want to say, I cannot emphasize enough how important your book is, the last one, and the job what you do, the work what you do. And I definitely will provide the links to, obviously, Pastille magazine, which I intend to write some piece too for you guys. And then, of course, reference and links to your book. And what can I say? It was a real privilege to have you today with us and provide us with the wonderful insights. And I cannot emphasize enough how important it is. And my profound thank you for being with us today.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me. That was really a pleasure to have this discussion with you. I think I have almost the feeling of meeting an old colleague of me. So, anytime, no problem.
Absolutely, very soon. Absolutely, and very soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.